So I can get out of the way and let you get to what you came here for.
How are you?
Today we're starting a two-part series. A lot of folks here have been concerned for and with some of our Latinx neighbors who live in our part of the state, in our part of the world, and who I think fair to say feel some anxiety and perhaps feel some special anxiety when they have been singled out for special attentions that aren't wanted, welcome, helpful, in our estimation, many of us. So, that being the case, a lot of folks have been involved with trying to learn more about what's going on around us. And it occurred to some of us recently that while a good number of folks here at Trinity have been involved in that, not necessarily everybody has. And there's a lot we, especially we white folk, don't know. And we can only kind of a little bit vaguely imagine. So we wanted to invite some other folks to come and tell us some stories. Tell us their experiences, tell us their reactions, that we might learn a little bit about what's going on that we don't see or hear or experience, learn a little bit about what's going on, and learn a little bit perhaps about how we might be more helpfully responsive and caring for our neighbors among us. And to that end, we have a two-part series. This week and next week, listening, just a chance for us to hear and learn from some other neighbors among us. And Betsy Warner is going to come and make the introduction of our first special guest.
Well, I'm really happy to introduce to us Joshua Romero, and he's the Community Relations Manager for the City of Bend. So we're very, very privileged to have him here. Before this, Joshua was in San Diego working with a medical device company and doing marketing and communications, and that's something he's been doing all his working life. He studied media communications at the Fort Loma Nazarene University, and then got his graduate degree at Ohio State, also in communications. He was born in Texas and grew up in New Mexico, and he will tell us the rest. Joshua, thank you for being here.
I want to start by thanking y'all. Is it okay if I put my copy up here?
Yeah.
I was telling Betsy, this is my first time in an Episcopalian church. So there's some cultural things, right? There are cultural things with all of our different Christian denominations and faith practices. Are kind of new and interesting when in a new space. So
Joshua, can you speak a little louder?
Sure. So if I ask questions, that's what it is. I just want to make sure I'm doing things by the Episcopalian ways. So with that, I'll go ahead and start off with sharing my background and why Betsy kind of asked me to participate in this with you all. I am Hispanic. I identify as Hispanic, so that's probably a good starting point. For people who are of Hispanic origin, the way they want to be identified can be really different. So I grew up in the southwestern United States. I was born in Texas. Don't really claim that as much as I claim my New Mexican heritage, which is really where I grew up from about 8 years old all the way through high school. And I like the New Mexican heritage because New Mexicans define themselves as a tricultural state. We're European, Native American, and Hispanic. And so there's some sort of acknowledgement that we're a mix of people. So I like to say I'm New Mexican. But with that, in the southwestern United States, particularly where you see a lot of folks with some sort of Spanish roots or origin, there's a little bit more diversity in how we talk about ourselves. So some folks want to be called Latino. I don't know that I identify myself as Latino because I'm not really from kind of like south of Mexico, getting down into South America, which is what I associate Latino with. Some folks who are Mexican American like to define themselves as Chicano. So I'm of Mexican origin, live in the States, maybe immigrated into the US. I'm Chicano, and so some folks want to be identified that way. I choose Hispanic, and the reason why I like to be identified as Hispanic is because it really means of Spanish origin or of Spanish sort of relationship. And for me, that's probably the best way to define my roots because my dad's side of the family is Spanish. They've been in the States for a long time. They actually came across with some of the colonization of the US. So if you go to northern New Mexico, Romeros there are like Smiths anywhere else in the United States. So lots of Romeros up in northern New Mexico. Now my mom's side of the family, they did come from Mexico. And it's not really clear how much of that is indigenous native Mexican versus some Spanish sort of mixed in there, because there's a lot of Spanish influence and sort of genetic mixing that happens down in Mexico. And so for me, Hispanic is kind of a nice all-inclusive. I'm not identifying how much of one thing I am, but it does identify that I am a person of color, and that Spanish and sort of that Native American component is in there somewhere. An interesting sort of side note is I just did this last fall one of those 23andMe genetic testing, and it was pretty clear cut. It was like 50% European, Iberian Peninsula, Mediterranean. Well, that's the Spanish side, and the other was kind of Native American stuff, and so that's my mom's side. And so it made sense to me sort of scientifically, so that felt good. I'm not completely lost. But with that, one thing I talked with Betsy about when she asked me to come join you all was I had to be really honest with her and say, my experience as a Hispanic in the United States is very different than a lot of our brothers and sisters who identify in any of those sort of Hispanic Latino cultures. And it's different because my parents are not immigrants to the United States. My mom's third generation. My dad, I don't know how long they've been here. And so we've been around a while. With that, very similar, and if you just look at the research on it, third generation on as an immigrant to a country, it's assimilation generation. So what that means is at that point, my first language is English. I had to learn Spanish just like everyone else in high school and college as part of your required classes. My mom actually chose not to teach my sister and I Spanish because when she was growing up in West Texas and farming, rural, migrant working West Texas, she got in trouble at school for speaking Spanish. So she swore to my dad that they would never teach us Spanish because they didn't want us to have to go through what she went through. Fast forward now, a career of teaching that she's had as a bilingual teacher. She now tells her Spanish-speaking families, don't teach your kids English. They'll learn it everywhere else. Teach them Spanish and they'll know both languages. So it's kind of a weird irony. One I'm not too pleased about, but it's the reality of my upbringing. So I just say that as a bit of a disclaimer, and where Betsy and I sort of landed was, well, maybe then it's good for me to sort of be the first part of this two-part series, because I can serve as a little bit of a bridge builder, a bridge maker, because in my childhood growing up, going to grandma's and seeing extended family and aunts and uncles and my cousins, it was Spanish being spoken all around me. So the level of Spanish speaking, and I'm by no means fluent, but I'm working on it and getting closer. So much of what I do know and remember was actually from those formative years of being around my extended family. Culturally as well, a lot of the connections I have to my Hispanic culture, and especially that Mexican side of my family, including some of sort of the Catholic celebrations and liturgical practices, comes from those experiences I had way back when. And so our formative years are very important to what our experiences look like. And for me, being a young child, particularly in West Texas, those formative years as a Hispanic in West Texas were actually challenging. And it's been interesting for me with a lot of sort of the political rhetoric around race and those issues in the United States, how much I've reflected on some of those really way back past experiences and hadn't really realized how much they stuck with me. So one example was I was with my mom when she was at a salon getting her hair done. It's what women do. And so she was there getting her hair done. I was tagging along on that Saturday morning. She had gotten her hair washed. Was getting toweled off by the stylist, and some water had dripped on her back. She just made a kind of like, ooh, there's water in my back. Just kind of laughing, giggling about it. One of the women sitting in a chair next to her said, oh, she should be used to that. Oh. For those of you who aren't familiar with the term wetback, growing up in the Southwest, and particularly in Texas, very derogatory slang word for someone who swam the river, the Rio Grande, to get into the United States. Looking back on that, I mean, I heard it, I didn't think about it. I mean, I was probably like 8 or 9 years old at that point. And so, I heard it, it was there, but there was no acknowledgement. No one said anything. No one corrected the information. It just flew. It went. It was fair game. Carry on with the day. So there were experiences like that I was kind of exposed to in that environment that until now, sort of with the luxury of an adult and some education and having these conversations pop up, that I don't really recognize. And this was a woman who is college educated, actually has her master's degree. She and my dad have done a tremendous job sort of providing for my sister and I the sort of standard American middle class dream. Both my sister and I went to college, both have graduate degrees. So we're folks who maybe culturally, maybe fit a little bit better with sort of the dominant culture in the United States, but we're not safe from stuff like that. For no other reason than this, what I look like, which is just incredible. And granted, that was 20 or so years ago, and I hope that we've moved. But stories that I'm starting to hear in my role with the city as I'm getting out and getting to know pockets of our community more and more, is the reality of it is in places, Bend included, some of that stuff hasn't changed, or hasn't changed very much. And so I think for me, what I really want to share with you all is the reality of those experiences and kind of the impact and damage that they can have in ways that we don't even recognize. And I know one thing that our Bend community is really hungry for is, well, what can I do to help? How can I get involved and how can I get engaged? I think for me, looking back on 8-year-old self, if someone would have just said, excuse me, what do you mean by that? Or, I'm sorry, but that's not appropriate to say. It goes a long way to, number one, correct bad behavior, but then I think also to show support and advocacy for folks in our community who may not be comfortable sticking up for themselves, or in some cases may not even be aware that some of those things are going on around them. I grew up, like I said, I grew up in a sort of middle-class family, and so one thing that's been really interesting about me living here in Bend, and as I explained to Betsy, for all intents and purposes, culturally, I relate to what is kind of our dominant American culture, which is like a white middle class, maybe suburbia, not quite, but sort of that, if that's our base, what we call being American, I relate to that because that was my experience growing up. The challenge with that is when you find yourself in some places where you recognize race, it's really kind of telling. So what I mean by that is when my husband and I were looking to move to Bend, we had visited a couple of times every year, really got familiar with the community. We have some friends that live here, and so we were visiting for about 4 years, a couple of times every year up to Bend. Wow, this is a great place, love it, we could see ourselves here someday. Being completely candid, the one thing that I had issue about moving to Bend, diversity.
Yeah.
And what it was for me, and this is what it was for me, and this is where it kind of settled in my feelings and in my heart. I'm someone who can relate to the dominant culture. If I go somewhere and I recognize I'm the only person of color, or that I'm the only one that doesn't look like everyone else, in situations that I typically feel completely comfortable in, but if for whatever reason it's on my radar and I notice it, how much more so for people who don't speak English, for people who are migrants and then, for whatever cultural reasons, not wearing the right clothes, driving the right car, at the right physical space, how much harder is it for them to feel like they're a part of a community? So I've been really fortunate since we've moved to Bend that my role at the city has shifted some. So I'm the community relations manager for the city of Bend, which means a lot of things. But one of those things that it means is that I work with community groups and organizations to really understand what is our community, the Bend community, what are our needs, what are the things that are important to people, what do we care about, and then how do we do something about it. From what I've learned being here at the city is the way city governments work are a little unique to other places. I'm coming from San Diego, where there was like a human relations commission, and they have their own projects and programs and do all this great diversity and inclusion work. In Bend, we don't have that, quite frankly. And so what we're trying to do and what we're trying to chip away at is where are those places where we can go out into parts of our community, places that we haven't heard from traditionally, and get them to participate in our processes. Because the reality of it is, city governments and institutions have a system and they have a structure. And until those systems or structures change, you have to work with them and you have to figure out how to make them work for you. And so what that means for me in my role is when we work on big projects now I approach the table in my support from a community outreach standpoint of saying, well, not only how are we outreaching, but how are we engaging and drawing folks into the process. And so one example that we're working on right now, and it's a big one for the city, is our transportation system plan. Transportation impacts everyone, and particularly for folks who are living on the margins. Transportation and what's available to them makes a big difference in their ability to be successful in life. And so what that means for us with the transportation system plan is working directly with groups like the Latino Community Association to say, you know what? We don't know the community as well as you know the community. We need your help for us to understand what the needs of our Latino community here in Bend look like. Because you understand, you work with this population, this community every single day. In the city, we're just trying to figure it out. We're trying to sort of make that curve and hopefully at some point get ahead of the curve a little bit. So working with community partners to really understand how can we better represent the needs of your community. Because when we look at disenfranchised communities, and particularly folks, and this is I think more and more the reality of disenfranchised communities in the US, is it's more about income disparity. The race, the ethnic diversity, gender, those things are all part of it. But really at the end of the day, probably the biggest challenge for folks are the economic challenges. And if you think of yourself maybe as an immigrant who's having to work two or three jobs, no access to transportation, no access to childcare, well, how can we expect you to be at a city council meeting and tell us what it is that you believe about transportation in Bend? I mean, that's the practical logistics of that are very cumbersome to engaging in the process. So the more we can look at individual projects that we're doing at the city and say, okay, here's transportation. Go to the community, and community, you help us understand what the needs are for transportation. So kind of along that, as my role has shifted to incorporate some of this equity and inclusion work, there's actually been a really big change for me personally. When I was in San Diego and I would have people walk up to me and start talking in Spanish, I would get offended. I would get offended because people would assume I am Mexican. People would assume that I know the language, which was probably more of an ego thing. But there was an assumption there that I equated as being negative. You're expecting me to be a certain type of person because of how I look. Fast forward to living in Bend, now when I'm addressed in Spanish, my face lights up. I'm excited. Because what that signals to me is there's someone in the community that sees someone like them. There's someone in the community that sees someone they feel comfortable talking in Spanish to at the offset. So it's actually sort of shifted my perspective and my own identity stuff a little bit to say, you know what, the Hispanic parts of me that have maybe been a little bit more assimilated into like a mainstream culture, those things are good. And they're things I should probably own a little bit more and celebrate a little bit more than I have in the past. And I think in particular because of my role at the city, it's really sort of pushed me into a direction where I need to feel comfortable in those situations. And quite honestly, a lot of times my sort of resistance to those interactions were because of my own issues of, am I Hispanic enough? Am I Mexican enough? Do I know the language well enough or the culture well enough to sort of integrate and participate? But now I kind of have to do it as part of my job. And so what I've recognized for myself is if I'm going to do this, if I'm going to do this well, I really need to just kind of go for it. And so I'm excited to see as the city continues to grow and we continue to sort of have opportunities to be a more diverse and inclusive city, what we look like 10, 15, 20 years from now. Do people feel like this is a place they can move to without having to even consider diversity issues? And so as we continue to grow as a city, I'm hoping we continue to put resources into our organization as a government agency to say diversity matters, inclusion matters, and the way we present ourselves to involve the community all really matter, so that we don't have people, whether they're like me or they're freshly immigrated to the United States, who look at Bend and say, you know what, I don't know if it'll work because I don't see people who look like me, or I don't feel comfortable there. And a lot of that is so much more about how we interact and welcome folks. And I know I've got work to do on my end, and I know congregations like yours are doing tremendous work to help keep moving us in that direction, and so I applaud you for that and absolutely encourage you to keep doing the great work that you're doing, because it takes a lot. When you haven't lived the experience, and for some of us who have lived the experience, but haven't really even realized how much it's impacted us, it is an experience. And so I thank you for your advocacy and your support and what you're doing to really include and bring together the diverse community that we do have. And so thank you. With that, I'm open to taking questions. I'm an open book, so fair game.
One of the things I consistently hear is that the Latinx community is a hidden community, and as a community relations manager, how do you reach out to that community when they're afraid to make themselves public?
Yeah. So, that's a great question. So how do you reach out to the Latinx community when it's a hidden community, and really a hidden community by choice in a lot of cases? That's a great question. So actually, when I worked in San Diego, I worked in public health prior to working at the medical device company, and one of the disease states that we did research on was HIV. HIV is very similar sort of dynamic, right? Is there's a community that doesn't want to be identified, in this case by a disease state, and so how do you get to them? Like you're kind of not wanting to be known or wanting to be found. And so what I found in that experience works really well, and what I'm trying to do here at the city is you've got to work with the folks that have those relationships and have built trust with members of that community. And there's a huge responsibility on my part to maintain that trust. Because if I'm working with the Latino Community Association, who's put in the blood, sweat, and tears to let folks know, hey, we're a safe space, I need to make sure I respect and honor and protect that safe space. So a really great example is working on the transportation system plan. Our traditional public involvement process is, hey, here's a really great big open house event. Everybody come to our open house event. Well, if I'm worried about my safety, maybe based on immigration status, or even just if it's a cultural comfortability thing, I'm not going to go to a public event open house and essentially make myself a target. So in working with the Latino Community Association, what we've discussed is maybe the better approach for working with your community is don't come to our public open house event. You're welcome to, and we'll translate things and folks can show up. But maybe it makes more sense for us to come to you. You host a meeting, you host an event, you work with the clients in a place that is safe for them, and then you can serve as sort of that translator, mediator of that information and knowledge and insight. So let's protect that safe space for that community and make sure they can still stay involved and engaged, but we're still able to sort of work with them. And so that's what's been interesting about doing this work. So other groups that I've talked with are like Ability, Neighbor Impact. So again, looking at some of our disenfranchised communities. And the reality of it is you know your community better. You know what works for them better than I will. And I can learn, but you work with them every single day. So I'm trusting your relationships, your knowledge, your expertise to help me understand how we can include them in the process. And I think that gets lost a lot of times is we want to dictate, hey, here's what I think your community needs. It just doesn't work that way. And so it's a lot of listening that I've learned here in Bend. Yeah.
What was can you describe your experience and how Ben was in interacting with you as you tested us and then moved here compared to other places? I mean, how did we do? Was there anything unique about how we did or didn't welcome you or make you feel comfortable?
No, that's a really great question. So how did Bend perform in terms of my figuring out, did we end up here? Yeah, or failed to perform, absolutely. Bend performed very well. And so what I always tell folks, and I've got a few friends migrating from California, so just a heads up. I've recruited a few more. But what I talk about is I call it Bend nice. And I mean that in a very positive way, right? Like, especially coming from Southern California, when I'm walking down the sidewalk here and someone's asking, hey, how's it going? That's not just a salutation and a passive, so like, someone actually wants to have a conversation with you. I will say, it's still taking some getting used to buffer my schedule so that when I'm ready for meeting, I can build in those conversations. But I honestly think that welcoming niceness that community has here in Bend is probably its strongest asset, because that alone opens the door for conversation, and I think more importantly opens the door for listening and learning. And so I feel like other than the visibility maybe of a community, Bend does pretty well. The other thing I tell folks too, and this is by no means to dig on our community here in Bend, because I do think it's a beautiful, engaged, passionate, loving community, is there's a big difference between a head knowledge or sort of intellectual knowledge of diversity, inclusion, those sorts of things, and then living it every day. So maybe in San Diego, we didn't have forums like this and community conversations and those sorts of things, but you interacted with lots of diversity every single day. So kind of by nature of the environment, you were kind of forced to talk and to interact. And it maybe wasn't as structured or academic of an exercise, but you experienced it every single day. In a community like Bend, where we probably don't have the opportunity to experience diversity every single day, or maybe we're not aware of diversity that we're experiencing every single day, these spaces are so needed, because this is where the conversation starts and where we start figuring out how we can do better. And you know, the reality of it is we're 90-ish% white in Bend. And until that number changes, then I think we'll keep having these conversations. And that's not a bad thing, because those conversations hopefully leads to a more diverse community. And then we can see that number shift and change, because the reality of it is diversity and what it does for communities in terms of economic stability, sort of academic experiences and value. Diversity is a good thing. And I think for a lot of folks in my role at the city, when I hear sort of fear around our growth dynamic, I think people are scared we're going to lose Bend nice. But I think we can keep it if we do it the right way, if we keep building community as we continue to grow. So I think Bend performed well. Just the reality of it is our demographics are what they are. And so until that changes, I don't know that there's a lot we can do.
So it sounds like you're a member of the LGBTQ community
Yes.
as well.
Yep.
Do you find any challenges in the interaction say maybe within yourself, between the Latinx community and the LGBTQ community?
That is a really good question. So, admittedly, I haven't been super engaged with the LGBTQ community here in Bend. My experiences in San Diego, I worked, volunteered with the LGBT Pride group in San Diego. I was our parade coordinator, and so I was a lot more active and engaged in that community. And within that Pride organization, they actually had sort of groups that work specifically with our African American community, our Latino community, even our disabled community, because one thing I've loved about sort of being directly a part of the LGBTQ community is it's sort of one identifier, but there's a lot of diversity within that community. So in some ways, I've really appreciated what that community's given me in terms of being able to be exposed and accessible to a lot of other communities. So that having been said, I haven't worked enough with our LGBTQ community here to really understand where our needs or deficits might be in working with our Latinx community in Central Oregon. I do know there are some very LGBTQ-friendly folks at the Latino Community Association, and so I would not imagine that folks accessing services and being involved and engaged through that organization would feel uncomfortable or have challenges. They have some great folks there. And so I think part of it is just a lot of the issues they focus on, and this is what I have to keep sort of tempering, right, with that difference of experience, is the issues that Latino Community Association deal with are very different than the issues I deal with. I mean, these are folks that are scraping to get by, concerned that visiting the wrong place at the wrong time might be I lose mom and dad. It's just a very, very different experience. And so while that inclusion is there, I'm not sure where it ranks in sort of the priorities of services that people are seeking. Yeah. Yes, sir.
First, some congratulations on the Bend Welcome Week.
Yes. Yeah.
You were
thank you.
involved in
Yes.
organizing that.
Yes.
So I think that, from my perspective, it sent a lot of really correct signals.
Right.
I just wondered how you and your colleagues in the city and members of the Latino community have evaluated that,
Right.
and where you would go from here.
Yeah, thank you. So the question was about Welcoming Week, and thank you for that. Congratulations. I was actually excited we got it too, and I know we actually had a clergy member from the Universalist congregation. Part of the reason he decided to go for Bend was because he saw we were a welcoming city with Welcoming Week, which was kind of, that alone was validation for me, like, great, we're growing our faith community. So Welcoming Week, it was kind of interesting how it unfolded last year. So around June, mid-June last year, the city passed a Welcoming Cities proclamation, which then meant we would participate in Welcoming Week. So we had Welcoming Week in September. It was a really tight planning time frame because by the time the proclamation happened and then staff, me, were given directives on what to do with that, we only had like 6 weeks to plan. And so it was a scramble. I applaud our community organizations and how well you all did coming together and coming up with programming and events for people to participate in. And I think, especially given our tight time frame for planning, it went really well. The evaluation piece of it is folks want more stuff in between just 1 week every year, which I cannot argue with. And we want more, a longer planning time to engage more of the community. So maybe Latino Community Association would find that they have a place in that conversation as well. And so I have a meeting, I think on Monday, with our city manager because I want to ask Eric, what are we doing this year and what are your expectations? Because we've got to start now if we're going to do it better than last year, and I think we have that opportunity. And I also really want to get a very clear sort of understanding of what the resources are that we're putting into this. Beaverton has they're similar population as Bend is. They also have a much higher property tax rate, which I am a little envious of because that means they get more resources to do fun stuff. And one of the things they do is they actually have 2 full-time staff that work on diversity and inclusion. It's a part of a third of my job, as I explain it to people. So it would be great if at the city we could dedicate some sort of resources to really prioritize that work. And Beaverton, they're a little different than us too, similar city size, better funded, but they also have, I believe it's 3 out of 5 of their residents are non-US born, and 2 of 5 speak a language other than English as their first language. But they only started doing their inclusion work about 5 years ago. And their demographics are way higher than what ours are in terms of the need for that sort of support. So I feel like here in Bend, we actually have an opportunity to get ahead of something. If we're starting to build some of that program and support now, then when we're 3 and 5 or 2 and 5, we'll be a lot better equipped to work with the community.
I'm interested in the transportation plan.
Yeah.
I notice we go to Juniper 3 times a week, and when we
Okay.
come out of there, we go by the bus station, quote
Yeah.
unquote. And it always seems to me that all the buses are there, and I'm thinking, why aren't they out in the city?
That's a good
Transfer
question.
point.
So our Cascades East Transit is actually managed by the Central Oregon Intergovernmental Council. Make sure I get that right. So they're managed separate from the city. But what we're hoping to do in our transportation system plan, because CET is going through and updating their own master plan for how transit works, and theirs is different because it's more regional, it's not just the city of Bend, but they're starting to do their update to their master plan. And so what we're going to do is, while we're planning for our transportation system here in Bend, is we're going to work really closely with CET to say, hey, what are you guys working on? Because here's what it's looking like for Bend. Let's make sure what you're doing for transit fits with that and it makes sense. So there's a lot of really interesting models that are used for transit in different cities that don't use here what we call a hub and spoke model. So yeah, the buses are all at a main hub, get you to the hub, and then they'll go somewhere else. Other cities do, and I don't know the correct term for it, but essentially the buses are just always moving, and they're dispersed all through the community. And so there are ways that we could reevaluate our transit system. So we're really hoping CET does that, so we can come up with a system that's probably a little bit more user-friendly and more accessible for more folks.
I don't know if it's an appropriate question or not, but I'm wondering what the city is doing toward affordable housing, so we have some place for folks to live, whether they're being, forward thinking about it,
Yeah.
pausing any kind of construction.
Yeah, thank you. So question about affordable housing, what's the city doing? We're doing a lot. And I will say that is one thing that I really enjoy talking about at the city is what we're doing for affordable housing, because we're really a leader in the state for what we do with our construction excise tax, which is essentially an affordable housing fee that the city leverages locally. And so anytime permits are pulled in the city, 1/3% of the cost of that permit goes into a big fund. And so since that fund has been in existence, I believe it's been $7 million that has been raised. But what we do with that is then now we have a pool of money that we generated here locally that we can then go to the state or go to the federal government and say, hey, can you match this? And there's ways to leverage and use that funding. I forget what the numbers are, but it's like multiple impact of that funding, because a lot of times maybe the funding is lent out to help support the affordable housing development. Once it's built, they can pay it back, we get the money back, and then we can leverage it again. And so there's a lot of really creative programs like that that we use. The reality of it is, in Bend, for people who make, I believe it's 60% of the median income and below, we're missing about 5,000 housing units to fit that need. Because as we all are aware, housing is not cheap in Bend. And so we're missing 5,000 units. The city very aggressively is committing to 100 units, supporting 100 units a year. But do the math on that, it's a while before we get to 5,000, and the city's still growing. And so the reality of it is the need is so great that as proactive as we're being, it's going to take a lot to sort of get us to where we need to be. And so the city council is actually working now on some sort of, hey, what are more things that we can do? Because they want to keep pushing resources and opportunities towards affordable housing. So we're chipping away at it, but it is such a big challenge in the city.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
As community relations manager, I'm just curious, you mentioned one piece, the welcoming week being a third of a third
Right.
of your job description, and I'm just wondering what the whole picture is in terms of your work with diversity and inclusion and that sort of thing. I'm thinking of not just the LGBTQ community, which is certainly one, where the city could be tapping into pride or whatever,
Yep.
but also the black community,
Yeah.
which, I mean, isn't a community as far as we know at all.
Yeah.
There's so few,
Right.
but they're here.
Yeah.
And there are others too who are diverse, and I'm just wondering what if you're specifically focused on Hispanic Latinx, or if you're out there with other things too.
So as we've looked at our underserved communities in Bend, particularly because the demographics are what they are, is what we're realizing is our biggest sort of disparity with the underrepresented populations is financial. It's the income divide. And so that's why we're really looking at working with Labor Impact, the Council on Aging, Ability, Latino Community Association, and hopefully COVO. I haven't had a chance to talk with Central Oregon Veterans Outreach, but hopefully we'll get involved with them as well, because they reach across demographics, right? They serve a community within that lower socioeconomic status, but they cross all racial barriers and divides. And so that's part of the strategy in working with some of these broader community groups, with the exception of the Latino Community Association, just because we know for that community in particular, sort of that desire to be hidden is a little bit more of a challenge for us to really engage that community. But I am always open to conversations with other communities that we could be working with, because like I said, I personally believe that diversity really adds to a community, and it adds to our knowledge and understanding of others. And so the more that I can be engaged with those communities to better understand what we could be doing different or better at the city, I think it makes a better community for all of us. So if you know folks or have places where I can get plugged in, please let me know, because I look forward to those opportunities.
We moved here from Salem about 10 years ago.
Okay.
And when I was living in Salem, I was involved in a variety of different organizations there, one of them being the Salem Human Rights Commission.
Yep.
And we had a number of infractions by the black community that they were being profiled by the local police department.
Okay.
So we connected with the police department and formed an organization there at networking, in which we addressed the concerns of the black people because of the stops that were being made by the police,
Right.
and helped bridge that group with the police department.
Okay.
And then the second thing we did is that we also connected with the Hispanic Latino community there, and also helped bridge those questions with the police department, so that that community was being identified and respected. And for 8 years I worked in funeral service here in Bend, and one evening on a Saturday night we had a funeral for a young man that died, and the mass at over here was probably between 300 and 500 Mexicans
Okay.
that came to that service, and I didn't realize the population was that big here in Bend. But you know, if they don't come to you, why don't you address going to them?
Yep.
And you know, maybe bringing in Police Chief Porter, I think that's his name,
Yep.
and saying, you know, if you've got questions or concerns or whatever,
Yeah.
you know, and bridging that organization with
Yep.
that community.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. So Chief Porter of our police department actually has a citizen advisory committee. And so he has a group that advises him on community issues exactly like that. That's probably the most diverse community advisory group I've seen at the city. So I think he's on the right track with that. Chief Porter is incredible. I don't know if you've met him or gotten to hear from him, but we are very fortunate to have him in Bend. He has gone actually to St. Francis.
Yes.
He's spoken at St. Francis, particularly around the change in the administration, to just sort of reinforce, hey, here's what we do and don't do in Oregon. He actually was at Welcoming Week as well to sort of kick off Welcoming Week. So he's doing his part to be visible in the community. It's an ongoing challenge though, right? Because culturally within the Latino community, there's a lot of misinformation around what law enforcement does and doesn't do. And a lot of times sort of that historical cultural knowledge of those things or knowledge of those things can really supersede information, factual information, and even a presentation from Chief Porter. Because I've heard a story about my cousin's sister who was deported by BIN police. It doesn't happen. I mean, but that's the reality of the experience for folks. And so we've tried getting Chief Porter out there for that very reason. And I think the challenge too is some of those events still are a little public and a little unsafe for folks. So that's part of the work with the Latino Community Association, is just where can we have these touch points to just keep reminding the community, hey, we're here for you, we're supporting you, and here's what we do and don't do from a law enforcement perspective. Because yeah, it's scary for a lot of folks in the community, and they need to feel safe.
Do you know if we have people who don't speak Spanish, but instead speak a dialect from Guatemala or from Salvador or some of the places that they fled?
I'm not sure, to be honest. I mean, I would imagine we do.
Yeah, we did in Washington. You know, when I worked with Alabama, it was extremely difficult to be able to find them and serve them. They were more afraid of any official, anything,
Right.
for good reason.
When people don't show up to access services because what are you
it's
doing
just-
with my information?
You don't go to the government for help.
No, not at all. Yeah, and that's a trust issue in a lot of cases. I'll follow them from their country of origin. Yeah.
Well, we need to stop, and this has been so informative and so. How people feel about this word, but I think it's enchanting to listen to you.
Yes, charming.
Hopeful is a really
Lucky.
good word.
Lucky.
So, you can stay just for a few minutes.
Sure, I'm happy to chat
People
with
can
folks.
ask,
Yeah.
individual questions, individual comments, and we're really glad so many of you came to this. It's so important. Thank you very much. Thank you, Joshua.
I think we're glad Joshua was part of it.